Our speaker today is Professor David Dorn. David Dorn is a professor of international trade and labor markets at the University of Zürich and affiliated professor at the UBS International Center of Economics in Society. He was previously a professor at the Center for Monetary and Financial Studies in Madrid, a visiting professor at Harvard University, and a visiting scholar at Boston University, MIT, and the University of Chicago. He holds a PhD from the University of St. Gallen. Professor Dorn's research connects the fields of labor economics, international trade, economic geography, and macro. In particular, he studies how globalization and technology affect labor markets. Over the last years, Professor Dorn has co-authored a series of papers with David Otter and Gordon Hanson on the effects of trade and technology on labor markets. These papers have been very influential in the debate on trade and globalization in the context of the US presidential campaign. However, the uses to which their results have been put are often not grounded in a clear understanding of just what it is this research does. We thought that it could be very useful to have an opportunity to discuss the findings with one of the authors. I therefore wish to warmly thank Professor Dorn for having accepted our invitation to come and present the results of his research and of other related research on the effects of trade on labor markets.
Mark, thank you very much for this kind introduction and this opportunity to speak here as a part of the WTO Trade Dialogues lecture series. As Mark has said, the topic of international trade has gotten a surprising prominence in this recent presidential election campaign in the United States of America, and we're at a situation where many people start to reassess the impacts that trade have on labor markets. When we open a standard undergraduate textbook in international economics, then these textbooks deal with the question of costs and benefits of trade by pointing out that trade, in principle, could be beneficial to everyone, because any losses that trade might produce could, in principle, be compensated by those who gain from trade, and then there would still be a surplus left over to distribute. Already the textbook treatise of international economics, however, recognizes that there is a potential for having segments of the population for whom the direct impact of international trade might be adverse. In the setting of developed countries, for the United States, for instance, or Western Europe, there has been the typical assumption that those countries are relatively abundantly endowed with skilled labor relative to trading partners in the developing world. Trade integration between such countries therefore could lead to a situation where the developed countries in the West specialize in types of products whose production uses in particular more educated workers, and as a consequence the less educated workers in the Western world might see their wage level decline. Now, in practice, there was, however, a sense that for a variety of reasons these negative effects just didn't seem that concerning. First of all, until the 1990s, there was actually relatively little trade between industrialized nations and developing countries. Most international trade took place between relatively similar trading partners like the United States and Canada, or like Germany and France. Moreover, there was a sense that in empirical econometric studies of the impact of trade on the labor market, there just was not much of an evidence that international trade had really been a big contributor to the major shifts that were observed in the United States and also in other developed countries as of the 1980s, which involved an increase in wage inequality as well as a decline in the employment share of the manufacturing sector. Much of the evidence instead pointed to technological developments, especially the use of computer-guided machines and robots in production processes as a culprit for these changes in the economic structure. Furthermore, when people thought about the possible impacts on labor markets that trade could have, there was a notion that these effects should be at a very distributed level, that it should not be just specific workers or specific locations that were affected by trade, but rather that any impact on the economy would quickly dissipate throughout the whole economy, such that in the end, the only effect left would perhaps be a slightly lower wage level for some workers. While the economic discipline was forming this consensus around the year 2000 that really much of the labor market shift seemed to be attributable to technology rather than trade, a new development was occurring in the landscape of international trade. That new development was that the most populous country in the world, China, had opened itself to international trade and was very, very rapidly becoming a very successful exporter of manufactured goods, leading its share of world manufacturing exports to grow very, very rapidly since the early 1990s. This transformation originating in China was a consequence of important political and economic reform in China. For several decades, Maoist policies had limited economic growth in China. As a consequence, China had fallen from being the 59th ranked country in terms of GDP per capita in the world to being just 134th by the end of the 1970s. In the 1980s, that rank then sort of bottomed out, and when Chinese growth and Chinese export growth in particular started to take off as of the 1990s, China moved back to towards its initial position, essentially closing some of the big technology and wealth gap that had opened with regard to other countries in the prior decades. Now, that process of catch-up that China had with regard to other countries came as a considerable surprise to other countries that are involved in world trade. In 1989, on the occasion of its centennial birthday, the Wall Street Journal had made predictions about which countries would be the big drivers of economic growth in the subsequent 25 years. And according to the Wall Street Journals, the big growth leaders that were predicted were Thailand, Bangladesh, and Zimbabwe. Instead, the Wall Street Journal expected that China would be one of the countries that would develop especially poorly, because it was assumed still at that time that China would not successfully manage a transition to a competitive market economy. Of course, now reality has proven different, and that meant for other countries that there was an unexpected and very, very sizable competitive shock. Now, one may say, what's really special here about China? Couldn't any other country also have created a big transformation? And to some extent, the answer to that question is yes. Other countries, of course, also could and probably did have similar types of developments. But nevertheless, there are some special features of China that are worth pointing out. One is that China, just by its enormous size, can correspondingly have very large impacts on the rest of the world. A second is that with this arrival of China on the stage of world trade, we have now suddenly seen a change in the composition of trade, where trade is no longer almost entirely an exchange of goods between equally wealthy countries in the West, but now we do see more of that trade where developed, industrialized countries in the West buy goods in low-wage countries in developing parts of the world. Moreover, and this is a very, very important point to emphasize, there was, during that period of Chinese export growth, a very rapidly increasing trade deficit of the United States that stemmed largely from that bilateral trade relationship with China. And this is a very, very unusual feature of this trade relationship that deserves much emphasis, because this meant that from the US perspective, the great increase in goods imports was clearly not matched by an equally large increase in exports, a feature that was different in some other Western countries that also trade with China. Germany, for instance, or Switzerland have much more balanced trade relationships with the Chinese. In research with my colleagues Gordon Hanson of the University of California in San Diego and David Otter of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, we have used this unexpected trade supply shock emanating from China to trace out labor market effects that have resulted from this epochal shift in trade patterns in the United States. Now, in principle, if the national US market were fully integrated as classical trade theory would implicitly assume, then it should be the case that any impact of such a trade shock would just immediately diffuse over all workers in the country. All that would in the end happen is that the overall wage level in the country for certain skill groups of workers might be adjusting. However, if workers are not immediately smoothly moving across industries or across geographic locations, when their industry of employment is particularly exposed to Chinese import competition, or when they reside in a geographic location where such trade-exposed industries are concentrated, then we will be able to see differential impacts of these China import competition in different industries or different geographic regions. Now, before I get into the results of that analysis, let me show you some motivational patterns of how this trade exposure has evolved. We see here in the left that between 1991 and the onset of the Great Recession in 2007, the real dollar value of US imports from China has increased by a factor of 12, while US exports to China have remained on a much, much smaller level. For other developed countries, both in Western Europe and on the Pacific Rim, we see also a big increase in imports from China, but that big increase in imports is matched by a considerably larger growth of exports as well when we compare with the US experience. In the US labor market, we differentiate about 400 very, very detailed manufacturing industries according to their exposure to Chinese import competition. What you see in this plot is the growth in net imports from China over the period of 1991 through 2007, expressed as a percentage of the initial US market volume that an industry has. Greater values of import competition are further up in this graph. And what we have here on the horizontal axis is a measure of the skill intensity in those industries. Those industries further to the right are ones where the US industry is using more factory floor workers as opposed to employing engineers and managers and other more skilled people off the production floor. Not surprisingly, we see that there is considerable import competition by China in industries that use a lot of production labor. But we also see in this graph two additional things. First, there is an enormous dispersion in that level of import competition, even within subgroups of industries. When we look, for instance, at textile, apparel, and leather industries, here shown with the green diamonds, you see that there are some industries that are very, very heavily trade exposed and others where the effect is much, much weaker. For instance, there is an enormous increase in Chinese imports in the rain jacket industry, and by contrast, there is very, very little Chinese imports in the industry that produces textile covers for car seats. Another feature that we once again see repeated here is the fact that import growth from China has been much, much larger than US export growth to China. This graph here shows on the vertical axis the net import growth, that is growth of imports minus growth of exports, and you see that almost all industries are on the positive side, so almost everywhere there has been more growth of imports than growth of exports. We can then make a further step and map these very, very fine-grained industry patterns into geographic locations of the United States. For that purpose, we segment the US into about 700 so-called commuting zones, which are clusters of US counties that are characterized by strong commuting patterns within a cluster, meaning that most US residents live and work within such a geographic zone. In plotting that, we show with darker colors those areas that are relatively more specialized in those industries that now have received increasing Chinese imports in terms of competition. Now, what we see is that there is a fair amount of dispersion. There is regions with import competing sectors in the New England states. There is some around the Great Lakes, although notably Detroit is not that much affected, since Detroit's specialization in car manufacturing has little exposure to Chinese imports. We see quite a bit of Chinese competitions further in the US South, where a lot of industry and manufacturing has located that is traditionally specialized in relatively low-cost production activities. And then there are also the occasional trade-exposed spots in the West. In a first research paper, we analyzed how these commuting zones, these local labor markets, develop differently over time as they are differentially exposed by import competition. We look both at the 1990s and at the 2000s up to the Great Recession, and also show that all these effects that I will now talk about only emerged during that time, whereas previously in the 1970s and 1980s, these now differentially trade-exposed locations had been on very similar time paths. For those of you who are interested in the technical detail, the econometric setup is such that we seek to isolate the supply shock component of Chinese import competition by using Chinese exports to other industrialized countries as a predictor for Chinese exports to the United States. So the intuitive idea here is that in order to more closely capture which Chinese exports correspond to Chinese comparative advantage, rather than changing demand conditions in the United States, we isolate the big part of Chinese exports that looks very, very similar in its composition of goods across many developed countries. Our results show that those trade-exposed locations saw differential declines in manufacturing employment. A pattern that holds both for workers with college education and for workers without university training. Now, perhaps surprisingly, these losses in jobs in the manufacturing sector are not compensated by greater employment outside of manufacturing in those locations. There is somewhat of an offsetting effect, perhaps, for the more skilled workers who overall seem to be able to better adjust to this competitive shock, but especially for the less skilled workers, there are additional job losses outside of manufacturing, and in additional work we've shown that it is especially also industries that sell their outputs to directly trade-exposed industries that themselves see greater job losses as well. So the offsetting side of less manufacturing employment here is an increase in unemployment and, to an even greater extent, in non-employment, that is working-age individuals who are not currently in paid work or not currently classified as unemployed. When we look just at people who still remain employed, we also see that their wage levels are declining. And again, this is an observation that holds relatively broadly for different skill groups and also for both genders. One offsetting feature is that those trade-exposed local labor markets start to pay out more government transfers, which is exactly what you would expect in a location where employment and earnings are declining. What is interesting, however, is to disentangle the composition of this transfer response. Unemployment benefits or trade adjustment assistance benefits, which are specifically targeted at workers who were made redundant due to globalization, account for only a very small part of the overall transfer response, with the TAA benefits being just a very, very tiny slice, even in the smallest bar. The big response instead comes from Social Security benefits, more people, for instance, moving into the disability program, and more payments for government medical benefits, which are paid to poor people and to disabled people, and also more government income assistance, such as food stamps, which are paid to people in poverty. If we quantify all these effects, we can, for instance, compare two geographic locations in the United States who have fared very differently over that time. One would be a place at the 75th percentile of trade exposure, meaning more exposed than 3/4 of the rest of the country. And another would be a location at the 25th percentile that is less exposed than 3/4 of the rest of the country. If we do that comparison, we find that the more exposed location will have lost about an additional 5% of its manufacturing jobs. There will have been relatively little or no compensating employment gains outside of manufacturing. The average household income per adult falls by over $500 per year in those locations, and the greater income from transfer benefits only compensates maybe 10 or 15% of those losses, meaning that although these transfer systems do react, they are not generous enough to really offset a large part of the financial loss. In other related research, we also tried to estimate the impact of this adjustment not on this relative comparison between more and less expected localities, but to quantify the aggregate job impact in the United States. And for the period of the 2000s, we estimate that more than 2 million jobs were lost on net. In a further development of that research, we then also asked what happens really to individual people who see their individual career being disrupted by trade competition. For that purpose, we analyzed about 500,000 individual person records from the US Social Security Agency. These are records where one sees the income and the employment situation of a worker in every year of their career. We classify workers according to the industry that employed them in the early 1990s at the start of this Chinese export boom, and then trace out how workers who started in later trade-exposed industries fared differently from those in less exposed industries who had, however, otherwise similar labor market histories. The first question to ask here is, well, do these workers somehow adjust? Do they move to other jobs, for instance? And we do find that that is indeed the case. This graph shows you the differential impact of this import exposure at the industry level on workers' likelihood to move between jobs or move between employment and unemployment. And as time unfolds, we see that those workers in the trade-exposed industries will actually have had more transitions in the labor market, so their careers experience more churning and more breaks over time. Interestingly, while these workers are likely to move to other firms, many of these workers don't really stray far from their initial industries, especially the less skilled, lower wage workers. They often end up in very, very similar jobs, similar to their job that they have just lost in another firm. And that, of course, means that they're still very much exposed to potential negative developments at the industry level. Also quite surprisingly, we found that there is very little evidence that these trade-exposed workers become more likely to go to another geographic location for work. So overall, there seems to be a fairly strong persistence with workers just not reacting very, very fast to these changing conditions in the labor market, and therefore also, as the next slide shows, accumulating considerable losses in their lifetime cumulative earnings. So the more import exposed their initial industries, the more a gap opens in cumulative earnings relative to people in less exposed industries. To again quantify this a bit, if we compare workers at the 75th and 25th percentile of exposure, we see that the more exposed worker will have accumulated about half an annual income less over the 16-year outcome period of 1992 to 2007. So this corresponds, if we distribute evenly over the years, to a 3% income drop in each of those years. It will also be the case that they spend about half a year less working for this initial trade-exposed firm. Again, they were making up quite a bit of that time by working in other firms, but while they can make up some of the lost work time, they often find re-employment only at lower wages, and therefore this differential in earnings does accumulate. The most recent research now has also shown that once these local labor markets where these workers are concentrated are affected by these consequences of lower labor demand, there are a lot of indirect impacts that are being triggered. Several recent studies show that trade-exposed locations tend to have higher crime rates now, especially for property crimes. Several studies find that there are increasing mortality rates. In our recent work, we show that there are especially greater rates of drug abuse and drug deaths in those locations for young people, which is the number one growing cause of death among young people in the United States, an issue that creates a considerable social problem. And we also see that there are changing family structures with fewer people marrying and fewer kids growing up in households with two parents, as well as more kids growing up in households that are below the poverty line. So with all these tangible adverse consequences in those geographic locations, it is perhaps not surprising that we now see more antagonism and more unhappiness in these places, also when it comes to attitudes towards free trade. Recent research has shown that those US congressional districts where those negative labor market consequences are concentrated have had representatives in Congress who have become more likely to vote against free trade bills. There is also evidence that much more generally, beyond free trade bills, these locations have become more likely to elect politicians from either the far left of the spectrum or from the far right, such as members of the Tea Party movement. And most recently, it has been shown that those locations also contributed notably to the electoral victory of Donald Trump. Now, to span the discussion here a bit broader, let me first start by talking a bit about the experience of Europe. Fortunately, there are now an increasing number of studies that oftentimes adopt the same types of methodological strategies that I have used with my co-authors and apply them to contexts in Europe. When it comes to labor market outcomes, then there is quite a number of studies that find at least qualitatively similar impacts, that is, losses in earnings and losses in employment for people who are in import-competing regions or industries. There is also now some novel evidence on political outcomes which suggest that regions in Europe that have been more affected by import competition have been more likely to vote for extreme right parties in France and Germany, and more likely to vote for Brexit in the United Kingdom. Now in Europe, there is also one very, very major difference with regard to the US experience. And this is the fact, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, that there have been some European countries like Germany that also expanded their exports to China in a very large degree. And research for Germany shows that when it comes to the export side, a lot of the results are really just the mirror image to these results for import competition, meaning that locations in Germany that were historically specialized in industries that now have found new markets in China, people in those places have seen their incomes increase and also their employment rates increase. Indeed, summing all up, these colleagues from Germany suggest that in some Germany's growing trade with both China and Eastern European countries may have had on the net a positive employment effect for Germany, where gains in exporting industries have more than offset the losses in importing industries. Another question that is quite relevant is how these impacts of trade could differ or be similar to the impacts that we see from automation. As I said before, there was a time when economists were very convinced that technology is changing labor markets much more strongly than is international trade. And I think that that assessment probably still stands correct if one thinks back to earlier periods, such as the 1980s. In principle, technology has the potential to trigger similar events than international trade and import competition. Also here, it is the case that we see a structural adjustment of the economy where some types of work see their demand decline and other types of work will hopefully face an increasing labor demand. So it is then upon the workers to find a way to transition from the type of works that are now losing demand to other types of works, other industries and other regions where labor demand is increasing. The empirical evidence suggests that for recent periods, the technological development might have had a relatively more smooth impact on the US labor market. There is clear evidence that technology has offset jobs, especially in manufacturing production processes, especially there in repetitive work steps that need high levels of precision and physical force. Also, there is evidence that technology has offset a considerable amount of jobs in clerical occupations, since computers are very, very strong at doing many types of data processing, data transmission, and the like, such that jobs, for instance, in accounting or in secretarial works have been declining as a share of overall employment. However, these are impacts that don't occur at the industry level. These are impacts that usually don't necessarily need that whole industries or whole sectors decline, but rather this is a redistribution of activities within firms, and perhaps that has to some extent helped the labor market to absorb these transitions somewhat better. Now, summing up these findings, let me first start by pointing out where these novel empirical findings from the empirical analysis of trade differ from standard trade theory that perhaps has long guided our analysis of the labor market impacts of trade. The first issue is that theory often assumes that trade by construction is balanced, so that every import that a country gets is offset by a goods export, and in reality there have now been relatively prolonged periods where this has not been the case in some unusual contexts, such as this important trade relationship between the United States and China. There is also an insight that has affected especially people in labor economics, namely the insight that labor markets, even in the United States, are much less frictionless than what people long believed. Meaning that if a worker loses a job, it's not guaranteed that that worker just immediately gets another employment with relatively similar conditions. Rather, what we see is that a very concentrated, rapid, and large shock can have also relatively prolonged consequences. An important consequence of this insight is that the losses from trade are not quickly distributed throughout whole skill groups in the broader economy, but they're very concentrated. It is specifically those workers in import-competing industries and those workers in those regions where those industries are located that have been suffering much of the negative effects. A third issue that we notice is that any such labor market depression can then quickly influence many other social outcomes in these locations on dimensions that would typically be absent from a typical analysis of trade. And finally, in the context of the United States, we see that this compensation of the losers that has always been sort of a mainstay in trade theory does not appear to be happening at a very large scale. When we now think about the costs and gains from trade in a more aggregate setting, then it means that we need to think especially about timing of these costs and gains and the distribution of these costs and gains. When it comes to timing, typical trade theory emphasizes that the big gain from trade is that consumers get access to lower prices and a greater variety of goods. In a country such as this one, Switzerland, it's very obvious that these gains are absolutely central for our well-being. This country would be way too small to produce many goods by itself for its own small market, and also this country is very dependent on imports, even for its export businesses to operate, since many of our classical export products are based on foreign imports, for instance, chocolate or coffee capsules. Now, the costs of trade in traditional models were costs that affect wage levels. And again, this is sort of a longer-term adjustment. In the long term, the wage levels of some people will go down. Of course, for other people, they might actually go up. However, much of what this novel research found is that in addition to these long-term effects, there are shorter-term impacts that come from adjustment frictions in the labor market. The fact that workers seem unable to very quickly adjust to changing conditions that are offered in the labor market means that we have these temporary situations of people being out of work. That is hopefully a situation that will not exist forever. Eventually, unemployed people find other work, or else eventually they retire and new cohorts enter the labor market. But there is a notion that we have a relatively big impact of short-term adjustment costs. Now, I've also pointed out here there might be some dynamic gains, some gains that have it even more in them that they only accrue in the longer term. And there is a lot of active research on those gains and other dimensions in which trade may or is beneficial. But the main point I want to make here is that we have to be aware that there is a timing discordance where some of these adjustment costs might come very early in a process of trade integration, whereas some of the gains might really be there only in a longer term. A second issue that is important is to think about distribution. And here it is the case, as I've already pointed out, that it now appears that some of those adjustment costs from trade hit very specific groups of workers in a very concentrated way. So it is just some segments of workers from specific industries and some specific geographic locations that are very hard hit. And since their losses do not seem compensated by a large extent, this means that for some segments of the population, the losses from trade are very salient. And I think a big challenge for advocates of free trades is to really convey to people what the gains are from free trade, especially given that gains such as lower consumer prices are very widely distributed in the population, such that it is often harder to point out to people where they see those gains very tangibly, or at least in the way in which such gains are quantified. Also by my own profession, we oftentimes tend to speak in estimates of millions and billions of consumer gains, but of course just coming up with large numbers is less tangible than for people than their uncle who actually lost a job because of globalization. Now, to wrap up, when we think about how we should now react to those news, then of course the reaction should not be to say that we should just undo prior trade integration. The key point here is that it is very, very hard to recoup losses that have already happened, especially if one now went on to impose high tariff barriers between the United States and China, for instance, then it would mean that there is a very immediate negative consequence of higher prices for US consumers. But also on top of that, it would mean that we bring in precisely a big novel disruption to the US economy, which then, as we see in labor markets, will probably create precisely similar adjustment pains as well as some industries that are very dependent on international integration would see their labor demand drop, and again workers would have to reorganize in a way that is less smooth than what people expected. So going forward, I think the channels that hold more promise is on the one hand that when it comes to trade integration, there is a sense that labor markets react more favorably to adjustments that are relatively slow than anything that comes fast and unexpected. In case of Chinese trade, of course, this development did not come due to a big free trade deal, but it just came through Chinese very, very rapid and very, very successful development. That also, and I should emphasize that, was in the aggregate an amazing success story because it lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty. In addition to perhaps trying to allow for more gradual transitions in patterns of international trade, there is of course also a sense that one might seek to compensate better those people who are the losers from trade integration. There are programs in place both in the United States and in the European Union that serve this function, and I heard that in the first installment of this discussion series, you have heard representatives of such programs explaining those mechanisms. As it is the case now, however, there is actually relatively little money involved there. And of course, it's certainly also the case that the actual design of such programs is quite a considerable challenge. Finally, when it comes to a prescription for my own line of work, it certainly means now that, that researchers in international trade have really restarted the debate about costs and benefits from trade. And what we're seeing now, I think, is a very, very stimulating environment in which people are willing to assess many more channels through which also trade can bring benefits to society. And so I think that in a few years to come, we'll get an ever richer picture that will allow us to make further educated decisions into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this, I think, very interesting presentation. I'm sure there will be questions because you touched upon a number of mechanisms, a number of issues that people of a lot of interest to people here. So I'll open the floor to questions. Immediately, I'll probably collect 3 questions and then give you the floor to answer them.
Sure. Thank you for the interesting presentation. The focus of your paper was on local labor markets that were directly affected by Chinese competition. But at the aggregate level in the United States, unemployment has come down. It was 5.6% in 1990. It came down to about 4.6% in before the financial crisis. During the crisis, it rose, but it's fallen back to 4.6 again. So at the aggregate level, clearly there's been some kind of reallocation of labor. I know that the unemployment rate is not, it doesn't capture everything. There's falling participation and so on. But still, there must be some perhaps out-migration from these affected communities, especially for younger workers. How would you account for the continued low overall unemployment rate in the United States?
Thank you, David, for that excellent overview of your work and other people's work. I think I have a fairly quick question, and that is, most of your analysis seems to be bilateral. And typically, economists don't worry so much about bilateral trade deficits, but aggregate trade deficits. Does that affect your analysis at all? And particularly when you presented the work on Europe, the other researchers' work. Thank you.
Thanks, and John Noom from the Irish Mission. Thanks for an excellent and illuminating presentation. Just a quick question, maybe you covered it and I missed it. And maybe it's to do with the aggregate level, as the previous speaker was referring to, but I've read a lot of papers recently about technological change and the impact of technological change, and I think the figures being touted around are the 4/5 of the impact that you describe there is due to technological change. Does that tally with your findings, or is this in particular just in relation to the bilateral impact of Chinese US trade flows? Thank you.
It is indeed the case that in the course of the presidential campaign in the United States, one often heard the question, why are sort of people upset even though the unemployment rate seems to be quite low? And I think one proximate explanation is certainly that part of the fall in unemployment has not been through the creation of more employment, but through more people being out of the labor force. So there is a very, very striking feature in the United States that for many decades after World War II, the labor force participation of working age adults in the United States has been continuously rising. Something that was coined the US job miracle, with a lot of that increase, of course, coming from women entering the labor force. And then we see that in about the year 2000, there is a very noticeable trend break. And even before the Great Recession starts, the US was losing a lot in terms of its employment rate. And the employment rate now remains at a lower level than it was before the Great Recession, and at a much lower level than where it was in the year 2000. So I do think a new development is really more people being out of the labor force altogether, and that strikingly now also involves more and more young men, people who for many, many decades were a group that would always be in the labor market, and now many of those people are out. When it comes to trade deficits, it is the case that the US is a country that has been running a very big trade deficit up to the Great Recession especially, and much of that trade deficit seems to be its unbalanced trade with China. In general, it's important to realize that we don't want to single out China as sort of, the only country that has somehow changed its trade situation. In a way, it's even the case that our result suggests that import competition from other low-income countries, from Bangladesh and Vietnam, seems to have had fairly similar impacts qualitatively than imports from China. It is just the case that China is the country which is much, much bigger than those other low-income countries, and therefore China is dominating this analysis and also the broader discussion. When it comes to comparing technology versus trade, it's of course not that easy to really separate the two in full, especially when you think that there are also interlinkages between those dimensions. Without a doubt, it is the case that technological developments have also laid a foundation for more international trade. We now have these absolutely amazing technologies that allow us to track shipments around the globe. We have these amazing technologies where firms in the West can, within no time, place orders on the other side of the globe and then get shipped things in a very controlled way, such that really these international supply chains were able to form. In our estimates, we usually come to numbers suggesting that Chinese import competition may have caused about a quarter or a third of the decline in US manufacturing employment prior to the Great Recession since the 1990s. And it's clearly the case that automation has also been a major factor there. So it's certainly the case that both of these forces are of notable import.
I think traditionally a central tenet of trade policy theories is that, yes, there are losses of trade, but overall the gains outweigh the losses. Now, what is your recent research, what does it do about the validity of that proposition? Do you still think that one can say philosophically overall gains outweigh costs?
If you went back 60 years, people were deeply preoccupied about the relationship between trade and finance, or trade and exchange rates, trade and macroeconomic policy. Have you looked at that? I mean, I'm thinking in particular this very high-profile debate about exchange rates, but even less high-profile subjects like the US dollar as the world's reserve currency.
First of all, very excellent presentation. I have two questions which are in some ways almost contradictory. The first one is, to what extent would you say the problem is an unwillingness by the winners of trade to adequately compensate the losers? When I look at things like the poor state of trade adjustment assistance in the United States, vocational training, even education in general, the weakness of unions, and I compare that with Germany, there's quite a contrast. But at the same time, if I could say that the United States has very poor ability to adjust at the sectoral level. But if you look at the economic level, the economy level overall, many years ago I did my first academic work on structural adjustment in the steel industry, and I compared Japan with the United States. At the time, I called the US situation adjustment by default because there seemed to be almost no real adjustment strategy. But at that time, there were predictions of when the Japanese economy was going to surpass the United States. So if I look at the adjustment at the economy level, the United States has done much better. Is there a trade-off between those two areas? Thank you.
So starting from the second question first, our analysis is indeed very targeted, not at explaining the increase in trade, but rather studying its consequences. So while my understanding is that there is active debate, but also considerable doubt that, for instance, the rise of China would really be largely explained by issues related to its exchange rates, I would have to put that question to other people who are more competent to speak about them. The adjustment in the United States that was mentioned in the last question, I think we have to be aware that compensation of losers is much, much more easy in economic theory than in practice. And the reason for that is that, first, it's actually not all that trivial to figure out exactly who are the losers from trade and exactly who are the winners. In some cases, that might be very obvious. In other cases, less so. And then we know that whenever we impose systems that compensate the weaker groups in an economy, we tend to create unwanted incentives in any kind of social policy programs. So that means that it's actually also, in addition to perhaps an unwillingness to compensate people, there is also a difficulty to do it in a very targeted and good way. When it comes to the adjustment of the economy more broadly, I do agree that there is a, remarkable resilience of the economy, and I think we can generalize that somewhat beyond the United States and beyond this present context. And if you think back just to the 20th century, there has been this enormous transition where at the start of the 20th century, still a very, very large chunk of employment in Western Europe and in the US was in agriculture. And I think that back in the time, no one would have thought that today agriculture makes up just 2 or 3% of employment in those countries, while we have a gigantic financial sector or a very, very large healthcare sector, or else a very, very large and booming entertainment sector. All those things are big transitions in these economies that certainly have been feasible if given some time. Now, ending with the first question of that round, what can we say about this general statement that the gains from trade outweigh the losses? This is a statement that is specific to trade models that are looking at long-run comparisons. In the long run, we have this favorable situation where the gains to consumers from greater trade integration are repeating year after year. As long as we keep up our level of trade, we just benefit from the lower prices and all the other favorable effects in every year after year. While any possible negative long-run effect, such as a depressed wage level for some workers, is then typically smaller than these long-run gains. In the short run, however, it is the case that if we really have a very disruptive change that comes with large adjustment costs, it's not clear that we'll necessarily have gains that outweigh the costs.
Thanks very much. Yeah, maybe two questions. One of them is the Chinese-US trade relationship is very much focused on goods. For many other trade relationships, bilateral trade relationships of the US, even very large ones, you have a better fit between trade in goods and trade in services. So you might have losses in jobs in trade in goods, but you have net creations of jobs in services for the US. Isn't that, don't you have here an outlier that sort of put the burden on trade destructions in jobs in manufacturers? And by the way, thinking of the dynamics, there is a big market opening up tomorrow, perhaps, in services in which the US might be well placed to benefit. And here I'm just telling you the story of Japan. You know, we heard the same story about 25 years ago on Japan bilateral trade running losses. But in the end, it did not prove to be so bad for the US in terms of trade creation, trade destruction. And just to get the math right, you said that a quarter of the jobs of US industrial jobs destruction was owed to trade with China. And what I got also from your numbers is that 2.4 million of jobs were lost in your study. You accounted for 2.4 million jobs, which is about 150,000 jobs a year. So is this what you're calling the quarter, the 150,000 a year, the quarter of net losses in manufactured jobs a year? So is it that 600,000 jobs have disappeared every year? And is this really what you account for?
Thank you very much. I have a very short question, playing a little bit the devil's advocate. In your policy conclusions, you said that basically playing with trade policy or increasing tariffs for the US would not be a solution because that would lead to another disruption in labor markets. But then that proposition would stand for any small economy that is a price taker. But policymakers or advisors in the US may well say, well, but you know, the US is a big economy. Even in theoretical terms, you can modify terms of trade by playing with your trade policy because you are a big economy, so you set the prices. So what would you say with regard to that type of advice? Thank you.
It really made me think about a lot of things, but one in particular. Trade has disrupted economies, I think, forever. And I'm thinking of the experience in Latin America during the 1990s with the Washington Consensus and trade liberalization, and the tremendous impact that this liberalization process had, particularly in the agricultural sector. I'm thinking NAFTA and Mexico, for example. And somehow that disruption did not lead to the sort of political processes that we are experiencing today, particularly in developed countries. Why? What's the difference between trade liberalization in developing countries in the 1990s and today? And you mentioned Brexit, the US, the recent, 2014 referendum in Switzerland about mass immigration. I mean, what's the difference now?
Good. The first question emphasized that we're studying trade in goods, which is the aspect of trade that indeed dominates when we look at trade between China and the United States. It is also the part of trade which empirically is much easier to measure since goods are physically present and can be counted at customs. If one speculates about the side of services, one would certainly expect that this is an area where the US is more likely to have net benefits. As for the computation of those numbers that I mentioned, I would allow myself to point you to my webpage where you can see that explained in greater detail. The policy implication for the United States is certainly that the US could live much more plausibly as a country in autarky than a small country like Switzerland. Nevertheless, it is the case with NAFTA, for instance, that there is just also in the US a notable amount of international integration. One reads about all these automotive parts who are shipped several times over the Canada-US border until actually a car is being constructed. So that would make me think that a very rapid, very dramatic building of barriers to trade would create potentially quite a bit of disruption in the labor market as well, even though it's certainly true that in the long run, the US would be more able to be just on its own than a small country like Switzerland. Also, and as an ending part, if we emphasize or focus the perspective on Latin America, then again, there is a sense that in some countries, trade opening has been very, very abrupt and in some places rather traumatic as well. It is, however, also the case that some studies show that, for instance, the gains from NAFTA have been especially large for Mexico. So again, it's always important to see that even if import competition has a disruptive effect in a country who sees the demand for its own outputs decline because of such competition, there is of course always the flip side of another country that is actually now successfully producing more goods, therefore potentially employing more people and seeing its wealth level grow. And that of course also means that at the global perspective, there is definitely a lot of good to say for trade integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think I'll close the session here. It's food for thought for all of us, and I thank you again.
Thanks.